So each December, of course, we gather with CityClub to hear some of the important players of the past 12 months. They join us to make sense of just what occurred with the goal of closing out the year by better understanding it. So how should we think about 2017? What is there to learn? What did we miss? Who will we miss? Who made it happen? Who's just getting started? These are some of the questions that we will be asking today. And the end of the year is also, I want to emphasize this, a useful occasion to weigh not just how our community and nation fared, but how each of us fared as well. And we hope you'll consider that too this afternoon as you hear the personal reflections from the members of our panel. Indeed, that is a hallmark of this event each year, the political and the personal. And speaking of the personal, I would like to quickly, just briefly, mention something I am thankful for this year, and it's my third grade teacher from Medina Elementary. She launched my career, you really could say. She cast me as the mayor of the Munchkins back in 1973. I was shorter then. And she put me on stage for the first time, and I've never really left the stage ever since. So she really launched my career. I thank her for that. It's been 45 years. We are still great friends, and she is here today. Ann Roster Wick, will you stand up? 45 years ago, that was my third grade teacher. Amazing. And no doubt we all have wonderful educators that we can thank for having changed our lives. Now, before we dive into the discussion, it's been my practice as moderator of this event several times to open each of these year-end gatherings by offering a quick poem to highlight the last 12 months. So here is my version of 2017 in verse. There were a record 4 mayors who kept Seattle working: Murray, Harrell, Burgess, and Durkin. Here in the city, cheap housing was rare, but boy, those orange and green bikes were everywhere. There were the Trump tweets, male cheats, homeless sweeps, and banned Russian athletes. This summer, Dave Reichert chose to retire just about the time we were all smelling those fires. There was Me Too, Amazon's second HQ, the opioid crisis, and the near defeat of ISIS. Another light rail overrun, but Bertha, well, she was finally done. This year, it seemed that mall shoppers quit going, but nothing, indeed, could stop Bitcoin. And finally, 2007 tested our many partnerships, but there was that wonderfully unifying event, the total eclipse. And so that is my year in verse. And now our panel. Jorge Barón, to my direct left, is the executive director of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, one of the region's premier legal services organizations. It's dedicated solely to advancing and defending the rights of low-income immigrants. Barón is himself an immigrant, having come to the U.S. from Columbia at age 13 and then going on to graduate from Duke University and Yale Law School. Blaine Harden is an esteemed journalist and author. He has served as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, a national correspondent for the Washington Post. He's currently a reporter and consultant for the PBS show Frontline. He's also the author of 5 books, including 3 about Korea. We will get to that with him today, no doubt. He is a local boy, having been born in Moses Lake, raised in Aberdeen. He currently lives in Seattle. Sheila Lange is the president of Seattle Central College with over 16,000 students here in the city. Prior to that, she had a distinguished career at the University of Washington, where she served as the vice president for minority affairs and the vice provost for diversity. And finally, Hans Zeiger joins us, state senator. We thank him very much for being available on late notice, as you heard from Diane. He was recently elected to the 25th District. He was a House member in that district as a Republican for several years. That comprises Puyallup, Sumner, Fife, those areas. He chairs, at least he did until the Democrats took control of the Senate. So I guess you're ranking member, apparently, on the Early Learning and K-12 Education Committee. He also sits in the Powerful Ways and Means Committee, which is the Senate's version of budget writing. He has a place at the table, therefore, in the important discussions that the legislature will face in the upcoming session. He is also the author of 2 books, including Reagan's Children Taking Back the City on the Hill. Joe Fain has not written any books. So maybe you are a more deserving panelist today anyway. Okay, let's begin. I ask you all, starting with Jorge Barón, this question we use every year because it starts us off so well. What were the top 1 or 2 defining moments of the year for you?
Well, for me, I think these events happened in January, and I think this seems like a long time ago now, CR, but it was the moments at the airport, that first full weekend after the president's inauguration, when he issued on a Friday afternoon the Muslim ban that blocked access to people from 7 predominantly majority Muslim countries to the U.S. And as all of you might remember, there was a tremendous outpouring of support of the community and outrage about that event happening. A number of us were actually at the airport, and we were actually successful in preventing a couple of people there being deported, but we were not able to prevent somebody who had already been deported from being able to stay here. He had already been deported. And one of the nice things about that situation at the end was that thanks to the work of our State Attorney General filing a lawsuit that eventually put that travel ban on hold, that individual who'd been deported that evening was able to return a couple of weeks later. And so those 2 moments early in January for me were kind of illustrate a little bit the back and forth that we've had this year of these policies and then the pushback that we've seen from the community, and you know, the fact that at that moment Seattle and Washington State were kind of leaders in that front of pushing back against the president's policies.
Blaine Harden.
Well, this year the 2 big events are North Korea's increasing capacity to hit Seattle with an ICBM, and then utter disarray in the Korean policy of the Trump administration. Both of those are developments of the past 6 months, and they're very concerning. North Korea now can hit any city in North America, and it's successfully tested a hydrogen bomb that's 10 times bigger than the bomb that hit Nagasaki. At the same time, Trump has repeatedly cut the legs off his Secretary of State Tillerson, and by saying that diplomacy is not really an option in dealing with North Korea, and the only other option then is war. So going into the next year with North Korea almost certain to test more rockets and more nuclear devices, and Trump almost certainly not to grow up, next year is quite frightening, I think.
Okay, Sheila Edwards-Lange, and then bring microphones as close as you can, all of you.
For me, it was coming off of the celebration of the 50th anniversary of our campus and the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Washington State Community College System, and so just a really high of celebrating the role of community colleges, and then reflecting on how our college presidents are now being called upon to respond to national policy and the impact that that is having on our students in our buildings, and getting to a point as a president where we couldn't issue responses to all of the things that were happening on the national front. So we issued statements after the election because we saw students in our building who were fearful and tearful and really frightened about what the future would hold. And then we moved into the the change in DACA and then what that meant for students, and the ban on Muslims and what that would mean, and then the change in transgender policy in the military. And so many issues that our students feel deeply about, faculty and staff, but I, as president, just having to issue statement after statement and finally getting to a point where we actually had to come up with a policy of how we were going to respond as a campus to all of the many issues that were happening around. So just the year of high and lows.
Hans Zeiger.
Well, I think at the state level, a defining moment was when we passed legislation in response to our state Supreme Court finally resolving in a major way our response to the McCleary decision. And I think we still have a little work to do on that, but we have gotten through the vast majority of that work, and we did some really heavy lifting. We restructured our state's taxation. We, I think, leveled the playing field make sure that we're leveling out, creating equity for school funding across the state. Not perfect, but it was a major bipartisan deal, and I think we can be proud of that.
Okay, another question we like to pose every year at this event is, what did you change your mind about in 2017? Let me start with Blaine Harden and then go down.
Alabama.
Sheila Lange.
Wow, that's hard to follow. Whether or not we're living in the last days, my mother's very religious, and every time something happens, she's like, it's the end of all days. And I really had to start maybe thinking, maybe she's right.
Wow. Hans Zeiger.
In the legislature, we passed major legislation for paid family leave this year. And I didn't have an opinion about that at the beginning, and I ended up coming around to support that because I thought that was the right thing to do for our state, and it was a great bipartisan success.
Jorge Barón.
Well, I think following Dr. Edwards, the idea that I try to be an optimist, and I'm still struggling to do that, and so I've shifted into some pessimism that I'm worried about. Not quite as bad as the end of days, but it's been a tough year to remain an optimist.
Okay, let's keep you here on the hot seat, if you will. Many headlines, of course, and you've already related some of them related to immigration this year. There was, of course, the travel ban. You've talked about the decision to basically end DACA, which looks like the administration wants to do. Protection for the Dreamers. Incidentally, there are 17,000 of them in Washington State. So you mentioned it a little bit, but give us your view on what the year was like in terms of immigration and the immigrant communities which you serve.
Well, I think if I had to summarize it, I would say the word that I would use is fear. I think what's happened with the administration and the policies that it has enacted or has announced have created this incredible instability and sense of fear in a lot of the communities that we're working with. And I think it's remarkable how even the Muslim ban that the administration implemented in January or attempted to implement, it had an impact. So there's obviously a lot of communities, even U.S. citizens, folks who are born here, who really feel like they're now questioning whether they're full members of our community. And I think that I heard from people during that time. I remember somebody asking me, somebody who said, my wife is from Brazil. She's a naturalized U.S. citizen right around the time when this is being litigated. And he said, she's now wondering if it's safe for her to go back to visit her relatives because we're planning on doing that this summer. This is a conversation that happened in January. And, I just found it remarkable that people were even having to ask that question, that a naturalized U.S. citizen who've been living here for a long time could even be questioning whether they would be okay to travel. But I think that crystallizes the level of concern that people have. Obviously the thousands of people and the hundreds of thousands in the country who are covered by the DACA program right now are in this period of complete limbo, who don't know what their future is going to be. So that level of fear is how I would say has created this sense in the community that to me is very concerning and very damaging.
Are you, you went from optimism to pessimism, so maybe your answer isn't going to be optimistic on this, but do you think there will be a DACA deal?
I'm afraid that there will be something, just because I think there is such a level of support in the country for not targeting people who are covered by the DACA program. But what I'm afraid of is that the administration and the majorities in Congress are going to use it to try to pass some very damaging legislation that people are not going to support.
Meaning something completely different that gets part of a compromise?
Right. So a compromise where they're gonna, either give funding to the wall or to, to take protections away from other people, or to, pass something like limiting family reunification through our immigration system. So reforms that, changes to immigration system that are going to make it even more unfair than it is today.
Okay, Blaine, at the risk of making us more scared, let's get a little bit more into North Korea here. You know it well, covered as a journalist, you've written books about it. You talked about ICBMs basically being able to hit anywhere in North America. How scared should we be of the North Korean threat? Did 2017 change the game dramatically?
It did, in the sense that North Korea now has a almost proven potential to hit the United States. So that's new. I think a comforting thing is, what has North Korea done in the past 70 years that it's been around as a totalitarian state? Well, it invaded South Korea once and went to war against the United States primarily, and it was basically eliminated from the face of the earth. North Korea ceased to exist. The great leader Kim Il-sung hid in a bunker, and it was only revivified because of China. So that's what they know about going to war against the United States. And in the past 70 years, they have shown nothing other than a rhetorical desire to play that game again. So I and a lot of people who've been studying North Korea for a while believe that they are not in the business of going to war with the United States. That's, I think, is somewhat comforting.
Well, then should we be as scared as the headlines seem to make us?
I think the thing that leans in the other direction is that the Trump administration does not seem to understand what I just said. And it is there's an increasing belief in the White House, among the advisors who talk to Trump, that war is a viable option. It's been categorized by various senators and other players as a 30, 50, 70% chance of war, depending on North Korea's behavior. And as I said, the president has twice undercut the Secretary of State when he's mentioned the possibility of negotiations, diplomacy, talking. And so that's very discouraging. Whether Trump is bluffing, it's just not clear. But the temperature, the risk of war has increased dramatically. And I think one thing that the audience should understand is that the chances of people in the United States being killed by North Korea are still very low and are likely to be very low for quite a long time. But if there
because the missile technology is still
because of the limits
young.
of missile technology, they have a few of them that could reach here, and it's not quite clear if they've solved the problems of re-entry with a warhead. They might just melt on their way down. But the risk in Northeast Asia, to Seoul and Tokyo, where there are more than 50 million people clustered together, is very high in any kind of war scenario, because North Korea could hit Seoul with artillery in 4 or 5 minutes. It could hit all of Japan with mid-range missiles that have nuclear warheads within about 20 minutes.
Okay, Hans Zeiger, let's talk a little bit. We're going to get upbeat, I promise you, before this is over. You mentioned the school funding issue, and I want to kind of have you expand on that. That's really been kind of the biggest chunk of the legislators' time in the last couple of years, is fulfilling that McCleary decision. You made great strides, as you said, last several years. You put $1 billion put billions into K-12. The Supreme Court recently said that your progress, while good, is not quick enough, basically is their bottom line. You need to have more by the time school starts next fall. The plan you have right now has funding kick in later, so the sense is it's a good plan, but the problem is it probably doesn't deal with the first year well enough. Is that something you agree with? And how much more do you think you'll need to do? And is there an appetite in Olympia for doing more for schools?
I don't think it's quite clear yet whether there is an appetite, partly because with the change of majorities, I think there's a long list of things that the new full Democratic majority would like to do, in the post-McCleary era. And I think this kind of delays the post-McCleary era. This kind of keeps us at the tail end of the McCleary era. And so there is revenue growth in the latest revenue forecast. That's positive news. And we can put some of that toward this billion-dollar issue. There's also going to be a lot of talk about new revenue. And, I think realistically, it's going to be difficult to find votes on major new taxes, even with Democratic majorities. But I think the governor made a bold proposal yesterday in his budget proposal with a carbon tax. There will be a lot of talk about that. There will continue to be talk about a capital gains tax in terms of where the votes could be found and at what time. I would think that a carbon tax may have an advantage over a capital gains tax, and the time frame for that would probably be more like 2019 than 2018.
What about just tapping the rainy day fund for some of this, just as this stopgap one-time measure?
I would be opposed to that, for sure. I think that we need to be very, very careful about dipping into the rainy day fund, and so I would be opposed to doing that kind of thing. But I think if we had the status quo where you had Republicans in charge in the Senate, you would see I think you'd see Republicans divided about whether we should respond at all after years and years and years of doing this.
And that,
and I guess there's some division among Democrats about that as well.
That kind of anticipates a follow-up. How sick are you of the Supreme Court watching your every move?
Most of what we are doing in the legislature now is reactionary to things that the Supreme Court is doing or telling us that we need to do. You can go down the list of McCleary, the Hearst decision on water, mental health, charter schools, fish passage barriers, and the list goes on. And there is a separation of powers, and I think that's important. As a legislative branch, we need to defend our territory. There are times where it's appropriate for the Supreme Court to make constitutional rulings, but I think in a few of those cases they have overstepped their bounds, and we need to be careful not to encourage that.
Okay, Sheila Lange, 2017 saw a lot of unrest on campuses and universities across the country. There were a lot of protests. There were a lot of questions about free speech, a lot of speakers that were invited, disinvited, some violence that happened. Your thoughts on that, given that you live in the world of higher ed, and did that kind of play out at Seattle Central?
Well, it absolutely played out at Seattle Central. I think that I mentioned college presidents are now trying to, this is the issue for us in terms of management, because you have students and faculty who are, rightfully concerned about what's happening in our society, and they want to exercise their free speech, but you have differences of opinions. And on college campuses, that is the place where you should be able to have civil discourse about issues, and that is an opportunity for students to sort of challenge what they know about the world and how they know the world. And if we don't provide safe places for them to do that, then I think we've failed as educators. But we also have to provide safe physical spaces. And so you've seen, even just here at the University of Washington, where people come in from the outside. It's often not our students, it's people from outside who come in and start the violence. And so we as educators also have a responsibility to provide a physical, safe place for our students. and then protect the rights of people to have free conversation. And that's a hard balance. It is always a judgment call as to whether bringing someone on your campus who is going to be controversial, whether that is going to be the spark that causes some violence.
Have you disinvited any speakers?
So Seattle Central is not typical of most college campuses, so no, we have not uninvited anyone. In fact, our campus tends to embrace protests and embrace controversy more than other campuses. So it has not been an issue for us. But we also tend to be more left-leaning. So our students we don't have, for example, a Young Republicans club on our campus. And on many college campuses, you have a Young Democrats and a Young Republicans, and that is, both of those student clubs will invite
But what if
people.
a Republican, what if Hans Zeiger came and spoke on your campus?
We
What
would
happen?
love to have Hans Zeiger come and speak on our campus.
There we go. And just one brief follow-up on tax overhaul and how it relates to students. You know, there's a question, we don't know what's going to finally pass, if anything, but some student loans might be affected. How will tax overhaul, as it's currently kind of conceived, help or hurt your students? Just briefly on that.
Concerned about the deduction for tuition and how that is going to impact middle-class families. I understand that there is some talk of compromise on that, but we know that the cost of higher education has gone up and that families are concerned about that cost, and if they're not able to take deductions for that, then it could influence college-going culture. That's why we're so excited about Mayor Durkin's Seattle Promise, because that would remove at least that barrier. But a lot of concern about the tax reform for higher education.
Moving on to one of the biggest headlines of 2017, we all saw it, we read about it, we're still absorbing it, and that, of course, is Me Too. Time magazine typified the whole movement, if you will, by naming them the silence breakers as Person of the Year. I want to go down the line with all of you and get your thoughts on this. There have obviously more and more people have come forward. There have been more and more resignations, more and more awareness of sexual harassment. You all kind of live in different worlds. And so get your thoughts on how this has affected you and the folks you work with. Jorge, immigrants, you know, they're often the most vulnerable to sexual assault and sexual harassment, and yet they're the least likely, we know, to report it. So I throw that out there as I ask you to kind of be the first to respond on this.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, what's happened over the last few months, I think we gotta acknowledge and appreciate, and we all owe a debt of gratitude to the women who have spoken out and the people who've come forward to report and to speak out, because, I mean, in just hearing, for example, the tactics that, you know, Harvey Weinstein used, like the level of retaliation that they were exposed to is something that is so intense, and I think they've, you know, really done the whole country a service, and I think that it was good to see that they got a recognition in that way. But I think it should be a wake-up call to all of us of what's happening, and you know, just touching on what you said, CR, about sexual assault and other kind of victimization in for the immigrant communities. It is something that we're deeply concerned about, and you know, going back to the situation that I talked about the fear. I mean, just a quick statistic, in you know, one place in the country, in Houston, they reported that they saw a drop in the beginning of this year of a 40% drop in reports of sexual assault by Latinos in that region. And there was no other explanation that they could provide except that, you know, the fact that Texas has been so prominent in encouraging local law enforcement to be involved in immigration enforcement led to people just not being willing to come forward. And so, you know, while on the one hand we are having you know, progress in the sense that more people are coming forward to speak up in the way that we've seen at a prominent level, I also worry about other folks who are not going to be able to like talk to the New York Times, right? The kind of situation that is happening, particularly for people of color, and what's happening at our hotels, at our service industry, at agriculture, where there's tremendous levels of sexual assault and harassment. And so I think we need to continue and to work on how do we make sure that all of our workplaces are safe for everybody.
Hans Zeiger, we're hearing more and more about this problem in Olympia. It's even coming to light there are some whisper networks among some female staffers down there about certain legislators and lobbyists to avoid or at least not be with alone. How kind of bad are things in Olympia? What's your sense of this in the state capitol?
It's an issue, and there are going to be some difficult conversations coming up this coming legislative session, as any institution needs to be having those conversations. We have a mandatory training in the Senate coming up, I think the first week of session, about creating a respectful workplace in the legislature. That's important. I think we'll see some bills to address this issue, to address making sure that there is a culture where people who need to report things can come forth and do so. And it's clear that there hasn't quite been that culture in the past, judging from some of the headlines about current and former legislators. And so, there's a lot more to come on this in terms of the discussions in the legislature. And this is something that transcends partisanship, and it has to if we're going to actually address this. I mean, it's something that we've got to come together as Republicans and Democrats and say this is, the problems happen in a bipartisan way, and the solutions need to happen in a bipartisan way.
Blaine, Harden, obviously there's been a lot of media resignations, a lot of high-profile ones, Matt Lauer, Charlie Rose, among others. Is there something about your profession that tolerates this more, or are those just happen to be high-profile examples but don't necessarily represent proportionality, that it's about the same there as it is other places?
I think there's something now about the media that tolerates it less, in part because it's under such incredible pressure, and it needs to be holier than thou. And I think that some of the cases with people losing their jobs, like Charlie Rose, it's a pretty clear-cut call. Other people, like Glenn Thrush at the New York Times, who may have gotten drunk and pressed himself upon young women who didn't work for him, that's a different call. But and the New York Times is struggling to decide, is this a fatal offense or not? And I think that the next year there will be an increasing sophistication in judging gradations of seriousness in these sexual cases. And I think there should be. Not all. There's a big difference between murder one and burglary. So I think that hasn't been sorted out yet, and the media hasn't really sorted it out. But I think there is one great political plus to the Me Too movement. And I go back to a statistic that sticks in my mind from last year's election, that nearly 49%, I think it was 49%, of college-educated women voted for Donald Trump after the tape, the famous grabbing tape. About half of college-educated women voted for Donald Trump, I believe. And the results from the election in Alabama showed that the number of college-educated women who voted for Roy Moore had declined rather sharply compared to those who voted for Trump. So I think that it is going to be a political motivator for women to turn out to vote and to be very careful who they vote for. And I think that in the next election cycle may be one of the most important demographic developments.
Okay, Sheila, Lange, we'll get you in on this. Higher ed is not immune, of course, but it strikes me there have been very few high-profile headlines coming out of colleges and universities on this issue. I mean, no big downfall of a university president or provost or famous academic, at least that I can remember. Is there a shoe about to drop in higher ed? Or is the culture of higher ed just kind of more evolved on this issue?
No. So I would argue that in higher education, the shoe dropped first because of all of the high-profile sexual assault. We had Penn State and Duke and accusations of impropriety among athletes with young women and with alcohol on college campuses. So under the prior administration, there was stricter enforcement of Title IX and sexual harassment rules. And so higher education has been, to this point, held to a higher standard of how we investigate Title IX and sexual harassment cases. But under this new Department of Education secretary, some of those Title IX enforcement rules are being rolled back. So I think we may see some more cases. Now, we've focused thus far on students. We have not focused on what happens with faculty having relationships with students. And we definitely have not gotten into the presidential ranks, although there have been some presidents who have quietly lost their jobs because of sexual harassment. Mm-hmm. Not enough of them, though.
Okay, our rapid fire round. This is another tradition of this year in review program. Starting with Jorge Barón, we just want brief answers here. Just one sentence, if you will.
I'm a lawyer. You want a brief answer?
What? Okay, what local or regional issue didn't get enough public attention this year? We'll start with you and go down the line.
So I'm selfish because I participated in the use of deadly force task force at the end of last year, and that issue of changing our state statute with regard to the use of deadly force by law enforcement, I think, needs to be again raised and considered, and I didn't feel like it got as much attention this year.
Well, there are 50,000 new Amazonians here in the past 7 years, and I just haven't seen coverage, stories, thinking about what happens when they start to have kids. What's going to happen to the school system of Seattle?
Sheila Lange.
And I guess related to that would be the opportunity gap in our city and growing wage inequality and what that means for our region.
Traffic in the South Puget Sound area. We got money into the 167 and I-5 through JBLM projects in the latest transportation package, but we have a heck of a lot more to do.
Okay, and now starting with Blaine and then going down, what local or regional issue got too much attention this year?
What the national media thinks about Seattle Seahawks' loss on Sunday.
Sheila.
And I would say that although I care about it, I think that too much emphasis was put on the solving homelessness and not actually getting at the root cause of homelessness.
I think we put too much attention on national politics and not enough attention on the flip side on local and state politics.
Jorge Barón.
So I think that the Amazon's second headquarters, I know it's a big issue for us, but I felt like we were kind of like in this panic mode in a sense that I think was not warranted.
Okay, Hans Eiger, we'll start with you and come down on this one. What didn't you see coming in 2017?
Well, I would not have imagined that Donald Trump would be our president. In fact, I only found out yesterday afternoon that I'd be on this panel, so I crammed and I watched and listened to a couple of the previous panels, and one of them, driving up here today, I listened to the 2014 panel, and one of the questions you asked was about who's going to be president, who will be the party nominees in 2016. Nobody saw Trump on the radar at that point in time.
Sheila, what didn't you see coming?
4 mayors in 1 year.
Yeah. Blaine.
The president dismissing diplomacy as a way to solve international problems.
Jorge.
I think the level of resistance or political engagement that I saw, particularly in young people. I mean, I know I was talking about pessimism earlier, but I think that's the one thing that does give me hope of the people who are going to the grassroots level, and I've been encouraged by that.
Okay, Blaine, let me ask you about your career also and your profession as we move into a little more politics, though we've certainly had a lot of politics so far. The media, I mean, CNN, the New York Times, they seem to be at war with the president. There are two ways to look at this, it seems to me. One is that the media is, taking this credibility hit. The other is that the media has kind of found a new purpose and that they've been doubling down on fact-checking and investigative reporting. Subscriptions seem to be up. Viewership is up for cable news, all the rest. So is this kind of the nadir for news or the heyday of news?
This is the heyday of news. I think that people's respect for what the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and the others have done has grown because people understand that it's desperately needed to check a president and a presidency that is completely unprecedented in the history of the Republic. And the role of the media now is more important, far more important, I think, than even during Watergate, because Trump is so outside any parameters that have existed before. I think this is it will be looked at in 50 years as the finest hour for the media, and I think they're performing very well.
You don't think media's, I mean, how much of the media hit, however, I mean, how much will they suffer from a president who's using the bully pulpit almost daily to, take down a reporter or a news outlet?
I think it's terrifying to be playing that game every day, but I don't think they suffered at all. In fact, I think they've grown. The subscriptions, the electronic subscriptions to the New York Times and the Washington Post specifically have tripled or quadrupled. The ability of these news organizations to fight back has grown. And almost on a daily basis, like yesterday in the Washington Post, there was this detailed examination about how Donald Trump cannot hear about Russia without throwing a hissy fit. So they don't tell him about Russia anymore. That's the kind of information I think, and it was deeply reported with 50 sources and no denial from the White House that is the way this White House works. I think that this is, ennobling, and my admiration knows no bounds for what they're succeeding in doing.
Okay, an announcement. Last call for those raffle tickets for 2 round-trip Alaska Airlines tickets. So get those in. You have until 1 o'clock to buy those tickets. Sheila Lange, this year's mayoral race had a subject near and dear to you, I assume, free college tuition at your institution. You mentioned it earlier. Jenny Durkin, of course, was the champion of this. She's now implementing it. Is free college tuition the game changer we seem to think, or is it more complicated than that to get people into these schools?
Well, we live in a region where we need people with some post-secondary credential, and we have jobs, all of our jobs of the future, over 70% are going to require some post-secondary credential, and yet we have one of the lowest college-going rates here in Washington State. And so
Really?
It will be a game changer for us. Yeah, so we have a highly educated population, but they're moving here from other places. And so what we need to do for our kids in Seattle, and even the Washington Roundtable, when they talk about Washington jobs for Washington kids, what are we doing for our kids in Washington? McCleary is an important part of that, and I really thank the leadership of the legislature for addressing that. But we have got to do better by our kids in Washington, and we've got to do better by our kids in Seattle, and that means giving them an opportunity to get that post-secondary credential.
How many more students do you expect to have? Do the community college systems in Seattle expect to have with this free tuition? Let me back up. I think it's free tuition for every Seattle graduate, but they can go to any of the community colleges in the state.
Well, the details on that are still being worked out because this is based on an existing program that we have at South Seattle College called 13th Year. And right now that only exists in 3 high schools. And we got funding from, that's why I said the 4 mayors. We got funding from a prior mayor to expand that to 3 additional high schools in in Seattle. And then we still have 6 more that it hasn't been expanded to. And that was just 1 year. So now we've got to do 2 years, expand it from 6 to 12. And so it will be a long process. And the mayor, in her executive order, has actually given the instruction that all of the city departments work together to try and figure out not only the timeline for expanding it to Seattle schools, but to what a regional approach would look like and what a statewide approach would look like.
And if you got more students, do you have the capacity, or will you need to go back to Hans Zeiger and get a little more money for capital projects at Seattle Central?
Well, you know, we don't have a capital budget, but we won't talk about that.
Soon, we hope.
Well, you're sitting next to the guy who's on Ways and Means.
So we do have the capacity because right now, with almost full employment in the economy, college enrollments are down. But what we need is better funding for the community college system because we fund students no matter where they are, no matter what problems they have, and the funding model just does not give enough funding to community colleges.
Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I can tell you, I think a good start at the state level is we need to put more money into the state need grant because that's an existing funding source for students according to their need. You know, it was a major bipartisan success that we reduced college tuition 2 years ago in the budget. That was a really big deal, and we got national attention for that. And then following that, with that legislation that resulted in that tuition reduction, we have a tuition limitation policy that I think is very important, and we want to maintain that because the legislature is infamous for changing tuition policies all the time. And so we want to maintain that tuition limitation, but also make that really strategic investment in state need grant.
Okay, let's stick with you just for one more question. This goes to one of the biggest races locally, which was that 45th District Senate seat over in Kirkland-Redmond. Democrats took the seat back. That, of course, was the balance of power seat, so they, as you have referenced earlier, now control the state Senate by 1 vote. That's been several years since they've controlled that, but now, of course, they have the House and the governor's mansion and the Senate. How much are things going to change? You know, there are 2 theories I hear in this. One is, you know, there's this laundry list, I think you even referenced it, of all these Democratic priorities that they haven't been able to get through, that they'll, you know, stuff the queue with all those things and policies and tax increases. Another theory I hear is that they will be a little bit cautious of overreaching and that they will be more incremental and they won't go for everything. They will see it as sort of a long game and that this won't be as revolutionary a change as we think. What's your sense?
I think there will be a bit of tension about that because you've got some pressure on Democrats to deliver on some key priorities that base groups have had for some time and that haven't been able to be accomplished over the last 5 years. And so I think you'll see some things that will easily get Democratic votes, go through the legislature, probably the Voting Rights Act, the Reproductive Parity Act. You'll see some other things that have been around year after year but just haven't had the votes in the Senate. But when it comes to the big tax issues, that's going to be a much more probably longer term kind of struggle within the Democratic caucuses. And some of those other heavy lift type things in terms of putting major new money into certain social programs, those will probably be longer term. I mean, this is not a budget year coming up. This is, we do have the McCleary $1 billion addition that we've got to put in. We do have, it's an election year, it's a 60-day session, and as far as I know, everybody in the legislature wants to get out in 60 days, so I think we're going to do it.
You haven't been very good about getting out on time, though, in recent years. Jorge Barón, Seattle is a sanctuary city, but maybe not for long, given that the Trump administration, they do seem intent on cracking down on cities and jurisdictions that that go that route, that have that designation. How important are sanctuary cities? I mean, does it really matter? Is that kind of more just a label, or is that a real risk for folks you kind of advocate for if Seattle loses that status somehow?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I'm of two minds about the sanctuary label, because I think it actually conveys something that doesn't quite capture what it means. So, when we talk about sanctuary jurisdictions, we're really talking about jurisdictions that have chosen not to use their own resources to help ICE conduct enforcement activities. So I think the way that the administration talks about it, it's as if they're, like local jurisdictions are like actively shielding people somehow. And that's not the case. We're just, we decided that for us it's more important for people to feel comfortable reporting something to the Seattle Police Department, and we don't want them spending time trying to go after people based on immigration status violations. Just like we don't have Seattle Police Department going to try to figure out if you paid your taxes or not. It's just not. It's a federal responsibility, not a local law enforcement responsibility. Plus, we also think that it's just going to make our community safer. So think about your house right now. And let's say that somebody is walking and breaking into your house at this moment, and an undocumented person walks by, and they're thinking about reporting that. Now, in Seattle, they're going to say, well, I've heard that Seattle is not going to report me to immigration, so they might make that call. But if you live in a place that is actively reporting to immigration, what do you think that undocumented person is going to do? They're just going to keep walking, right? Now, nothing's going to happen to the undocumented person, but your house got broken into, the next person's house is going to break into. So it's just, and there's statistics. This is not just anecdotal. This is like the actual statistics that show that jurisdictions that don't cooperate with local law enforcement are actually safer. And so it's good for public safety. I think the administration has this idea that they try to frame it as in this is like, good for the bad guys, and it's actually better if people are reporting and providing information. That's how we solve crimes. That's how we get public safety. That's how we make the whole community stronger. So I think that we do see an impact. I think it is important, but I do think it's important for people to understand what it actually means, because I think there is a lot of misconceptions about this issue of sanctuary jurisdictions.
Okay, a couple more rapid fire before we get to audience questions. There's a microphone, so you can go ahead and line up there. Starting with Hans Zeiger, the most troubling visual image for you of 2017.
I think there was a picture of fire down along the Columbia River, and it was one that you won't forget.
Sheila Lange.
Police shootings, and with the advent of cameras now, you just see all of these shootings, and it's very disturbing.
Blaine Harden.
Yesterday's picture of Ivanka Trump's face as she watched her father say that the tax cut is going to be good for regular people.
What did her face look like?
Ice cold.
Okay, Jorge Barón.
I think I'm going to say that broken window on the Mandalay Hotel in Las Vegas, and just that image of somebody with all these guns, assault weapons, and shooting down at innocent people who are attending a concert. And I hope that the future will be that we do something about that, including here in our own state.
What keeps you optimistic? Sheila.
Well, the Alabama election.
Blaine.
I was going to say that, but I have two kids, 13 and 15, and they are bright and hopeful, and I just see a lot of hope in them.
Jorge.
People of color, and particularly women of color that are engaged and that particularly have put themselves out to be in political office. We saw that here in our own city. Not only on the voting that we saw in Alabama, that's a clear illustration, but also here in our city council that people are putting themselves out there and running for political office, which is really important and a big deal.
Hans Zeiger.
So we've got some great leaders in this state. I mean, we hear so much about bad leadership right now, but I think there's a couple of, I'll mention a couple of really great leaders. One is Bruce Dammeier, who's our county executive in Pierce County, getting great reviews all around. a very pragmatic leader who's winning respect on both sides of the aisle. The other one I'll mention, a Democrat, is Christine Rolfes, who's the incoming chair of the Ways and Means Committee. She was the ranking member on the Education Committee in the Senate. I was chair, and we worked together closely on that committee, and she's a great pragmatic leader.
Okay, and finally, what book, piece of art, music, or film do you remember the most and why? Jorge, and then quickly go down the line.
Well, I'll be selfish and I'll say, I know I should say the
Blaine's
King of Spies that came out recently, and I will make a plug for that. But I was fortunate to attend the U2 concert at CenturyLink Field in May on the date of my wife's anniversary, our anniversary, and so it was particularly telling. So.
This year I read Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad, and the resonance of that book and in the genocide, slavery, and its connection to the rise of Donald Trump, it's just resonated in my heart all year long.
Sheila Lange.
The Seattle Art Museum hosted the Jacob Lawrence Migration Series earlier this year, and the images of that were so optimistic for me, and just wonderful to see.
One of the best books I came across this year, I finally picked up Ivan Doig and read his great book, This House of Sky. I actually listened to it on audiobook. A great Seattle writer.
That's great. Okay, yes.
I'm Virginia Felton, and my question is for Mr. Ziegler, our legislator. Yesterday was the 5th anniversary of the Sandy Hook Massacre. And we have spent a lot of time and a lot of money in this state through the very painful process of citizen initiatives to get 2 important regulations passed. I'd like to know what your commitment to gun sense legislation is, and what do you think is going to happen this year?
Thank you. I've signed on as a co-sponsor on legislation to ban bump stocks in Washington State, and I think that's important legislation to pass, particularly in light of the Las Vegas shooting. But I think that's common sense, policy that we can agree on as Republicans and Democrats. I hope so.
Okay, sir.
Thanks. The other obvious fault line that we've alluded to this year is around race, with the NFL protests, Charlottesville, et cetera. And we talked about the Alabama difference in terms of voting the white population, the black population, but before we let ourselves off the hook here in Seattle, there's obviously a huge difference in terms of racial turnout in the mayoral race and the primary as well as the general. So I guess I'm interested in thoughts from all the panelists around what do you see as the most hopeful prospects in 2018 for multiracial initiatives, multiracial organizing?
We don't have a ton of time, so whoever's most passionate, a couple of you.
Well, I mean, I will say that I think we did see some progress in that area. In the Burien local election, we saw that there was a very strong and heated and controversial thing, but we saw people of color being elected, and I was grateful that there was a rejection of some of the anti-immigrant and frankly, racist rhetoric that was there locally. So I do see some progress in that area, and I think there's a lot of organizing that's happened. But I think your point is right. I mean, I think there is still, I think somebody pointed out recently that if we had, we had a lot of people here, congratulating the, African-American women in Alabama, but who were not as supportive of Nikita Oliver, and dismissed her as somebody who couldn't who was not couldn't speak out on issues, and so I think we do need to look at each other when we talk that way.
Anyone else? Okay, yes.
This is for Mr. Harden. It's actually about North Korea. So I read yesterday, the first time I thought about this, that one of the possible outcomes of what's going on there would be the collapse of North Korea. I remember the collapse, of communism in the USSR and the Berlin Wall. What would that look like? Would China probably not stand by and watch this occur? What if you had your crystal ball and saw that happening? What do you think the outcome of that would look like?
China has recently moved to set up refugee camps along the border, reporting this week. So it's something that they're concerned about. So it's a possibility. These kind of regimes don't last forever, although North Korea's has lasted more than 3 times longer than any other similar regime. Having said that, North Korea right now is not unstable. The leadership seems solid. The economy is doing rather better than before. More people are eating. And the confrontation with the evil enemy, the United States, gives the regime a sense of legitimacy that it needs for long-term survival. So I think that those thinking that North Korea might collapse should think again.
Yes.
A question for Mr. Barón. In what way would you like to have seen San Francisco communicate better with ICE so as to remove Kate Steinle's killer from the country before he had a chance to pick up Sally Jewell's gun?
Well, I think the key thing about that case, and in some ways that illustrates the challenge, is that the problem in that particular case is that that individual had been deported previously, which in some ways also to me shows that deportations are not the solution to this issue. But the federal government had ample ability, because there's a federal crime of illegal reentry after deportation, where they could have gotten a judicial warrant. They go to a federal judge and say, look, we have this, and that's what they failed to do. And that's part of the problem that San Francisco hasn't articulated properly, is that the reason that they have this policy, just like actually every sheriff in this state actually has a policy that they need a judicial warrant to hold people right now, is because they're afraid that they're going to get sued correctly, because you can't hold people just on the say-so of a federal agency. So the point is, the federal government could have gotten a warrant in that situation. They didn't, and now they're blaming San Francisco when really the fault lay on the federal government.
Okay, we have time for one more audience question.
Senator Ziegler, returning to gun control. Bump stocks would be a good step, but what about high-capacity magazines? I'm retired from deer hunting now, but when I was a younger man, I did hunt deer with a 7-shot lever-action rifle, and I killed every deer which I shot. I think high-capacity magazines aren't necessary for sport hunting, but they are very useful if you want to go out and conduct mass murder against your fellow citizens.
Happy to talk further about that. I mean, I think, one of the things I've realized is that is one issue where I don't want to be going down the NRA checklist looking for an A+ rating, because I need to do what's right for my constituents. And so happy to talk further about that.
Thank you, Senator.
Okay, if it's brief.
It's for everyone.
Oh, then it's probably not brief.
Do you see Seattle and Washington State as a leader to the U.S. and the world?
Yes.
Anyone want to jump in on that?
Much more than in the past.
I say yes, because Seattle seems to be much more civically engaged than other places. People here, they get together, no matter what side you're on, and talk about the issues and try and come up with solutions, and that's why I decided to make this my home.
I think there's tremendous possibility here, and I always tell people things are much more functional in this Washington than they are in the other Washington, and that's a ray of hope for me, and I think we can continue to prove that if we're willing.
Okay, we end the same way that we end these every year, which is a nice 3-part rapid-fire round. Again, just kind of some brief statements from all of you to close out. Who do you look for inspiration? Jorge Barón.
The clients I work with, people who've experienced, tremendous adversity. Many of them are fleeing, persecution and some horrible things in their life, and they still remain hopeful. And when we're able to help them, and they, just continue to contribute to the community. So that's who I look for.
Blaine?
My kids.
Sheila Lange?
The students that I work with on my campus, their stories are incredible. They are so motivated to get the education, and it's just inspiring to be with them.
I got to be part of a fellowship program through the Henry M. Jackson Foundation this year, and I saw one of my fellows in the room today, Kiana Scott, who's here as well. And I think there's a rising generation of leaders here in the Seattle area who are determined to get things done, to work together collaboratively, and that's really inspiring to me.
And you're one of them, 32 years old, Hans Zeiger. Good for him. Okay, Blaine Harden, what are you going to focus on in 2018?
Something other than North Korea.
Time for a break from that, yeah. Okay, Sheila Lange.
Implementing the Seattle Promise.
Which is the free college tuition?
The free college tuition.
Hans Zeiger.
Being part of a constructive minority in the legislature as opposed to just opposing things. I think we need to add value to our legislative process. So thank you.
So I'm going to try to be optimistic. I'm going to say Congress is going to pass a Clean Dream Act, so next year we'll be helping people apply for that protection and green cards.
Okay, and finally, though it was about the year in review, we do want to get their sense of 2018 as the year changes here. Jorge, you kind of just gave us one, but what is a big prediction for you going into 2018?
Well, now I have to be pessimistic then. I, unfortunately, and I do want to acknowledge that there's, as we speak this afternoon, that there's 1,500 of our neighbors detained at the Immigration Detention Center in Tacoma. And unfortunately, I think we're going to see more of that, and that's one thing that I hope people will be paying more attention to, what's happening here locally in terms of immigration enforcement and how our neighbors are being separated. So we'll be fighting to make sure that less families are separated by those policies.
2018 prediction.
I think that the 2018 congressional election will be a big deal and will change the course of the Trump administration. But I also think there's great risk as that election approaches, particularly vis-a-vis North Korea, as a distraction and as a way to turn the public towards, rah-rah patriotism.
Are you predicting a congressional change in terms of leadership? Will Democrats take either house?
I think there's a very good chance of it.
Sheila, your predictions?
That we'll see a collaboration between schools, business, industry, private philanthropy coming together to address some of our region's toughest issues that we haven't been able to address.
Hans Zeiger.
I think you're going to see the rise of a strong movement in the middle, the political middle, because I think a lot of people out there tired of the extremes, tired of the polarization.
You mean locally and nationally?
I think both locally and nationally. I think we're going to see a growing movement.
Okay, as we close out here, we want to thank them. I also just want to give another shout out for Hans Zeiger. At the last minute, last night, he agreed to come in and sit in for Joe Fain. And the next time I see Joe Fain, I'm going to say, hey, we don't need you anymore, Joe. We've got Hans Zeiger. Diane's going to close us out, but let's thank the panelists once again.